Big spring was on its way to becoming big summer. The snow was gone from the southern end of the plateau, and once again game migrated up the valleys east of the caves. There were many things to be done now that big winter was past, and they could have the chance to do them. They needed a larger pottery kiln, a larger workshop and a wooden lathe, more diamonds to make cutting wheels, more quartz crystals to make binoculars and microscopes. They could again explore the field of inorganic chemistry, even though results in the past had produced nothing of value, and they could, within a few years, resume the metal prospecting up the plateau, the most important project of all. Their weapons seemed to be as perfect as was possible, but when the Gurns came, they would need some quick and certain means of communication between the various units that would fight the Gurns. A leader who could not communicate with his forces and coordinate their actions would be helpless. And they had on Ragnarok a form of communication, if trained, that the Gurns could not detect or interfere with electronically: the mockers. The crags were still white and impassable with snow that summer, but the snow was receding higher each year. 5 years later, in the summer of 135, the crags were passable for a few weeks. Lake led a party of 8 over them and down into the chasm. They took with them 2 small cages, constructed of wood and glass and made airtight with the strong Medusa bush glue. Each cage was equipped with a simple air pump and a pressure gauge. They brought back 2 pairs of mockers, as interested and trusting captives, together with a supply of the orange corn and a large amount of diamonds. The mockers, in their pressure-maintained cages, were not even aware of the increase in elevation as they were carried over the high summit of the crags. To Lake, and the men with him, the climb back up the long, steep slope of the mountain was a stiff climb to make in one day, but no more than that. It was hard to believe that it had taken Humboldt and Barber almost 3 days to climb it, and that Barber had died in the attempt. It reminded him of the old crossbows that Humboldt and the others had used. They were thin, with a light pull, such as the present generation boys used. It must have required courage for the old ones to dare unicorn attacks, with bows so thin that only the small area behind the unicorn's jaws was vulnerable to their arrows. When the caves were reached, a very gradual reduction of pressure in the mocker cages was started, one that would cover a period of weeks. 1 pair of mockers survived, and had 2 young ones that fall. The young mockers, like the first generation of Ragnarok-born children of many years before, were more adapted to their environment than their parents were. The orange corn was planted, using an adaptation method somewhat similar to that used with the mockers. It might have worked had the orange corn not required such a long period of time in which to reach maturity. When winter came, only a few grains had formed. They were saved for next year's seeds, to continue the slow adaptation process. By the 5th year, the youngest generation of mockers was well adapted to the elevation of the caves, but for a susceptibility to a quickly fatal form of pneumonia, which made it necessary to keep them from exposing themselves to the cold or to any sudden changes of temperature. Their intelligence was surprising, and they seemed to be partially receptive to human thoughts, as Bill Humboldt had written. By the end of the 15th year, their training had reached such a stage of perfection that a mocker would transmit or not transmit with only the unspoken thought of its master to tell it which it should be. In addition, they would transmit the message to whichever mocker their master's thought directed. Presumably, all mockers received the message, but only the mocker to whom it was addressed would repeat it aloud. They had their method of communication. They had their automatic crossbows for quick, close fighting, and their long-range longbows. They were fully adapted to the 1.5 gravity, and their reflexes were almost like those of prowlers. Ragnarok had long ago separated the quick from the dead. There were 819 of them that year, in the early spring of 150, and they were ready and impatient for the coming of the Gurns. Then the transmitter, which had been in operation again for many years, failed one day. George Craig had finished checking it when Lake arrived. He looked up from his instruments, remarkably similar in appearance to a sketch of the old George Ord, a resemblance that had been passed down to him by his mother, and said, "The entire circuit is either gone or ready to go. It's already operated for a lot longer than it should have." "It doesn't matter," Lake said. "It served its purpose. We won't rebuild it." George watched him questioningly. "It served its purpose," he said again. "It didn't let us forget that the Gurns will come again. But that isn't enough now. The first signal won't reach Athena until the year 235. It will be the dead of big winter again then. They'll have to fight the Gurns with bows and arrows that the cold will make as brittle as glass. They won't have a chance." "No," George said, "they won't have a chance. But what can we do to change it?" "It's something I've been thinking about," he said. "We'll build a hyperspace transmitter and bring the Gurns before big winter comes." "We will?" George asked, lifting his dark eyebrows. "And what do we use for the 300 pounds of copper and 500 pounds of iron we would have to make the generator?" "Surely we can find 500 pounds of iron somewhere on Ragnarok. The north end of the plateau might be the best bet. As for the copper, I doubt that we'll ever find it. But there are seams of a bauxite-like clay in the western hills. They're certain to contain aluminum, to at least some extent, so we'll make the wires of aluminum." "The ore would have to be refined to pure aluminum oxide before it could be smelted," George said. "And you can't smelt aluminum ore in an ordinary furnace. Only in an electric furnace with a generator that can supply a high amperage. And we would have to have cryolite ore to serve as the solvent in the smelting process." "There's a seam of cryolite in the eastern hills, according to the old maps," said Lake. "We can make a larger generator by melting down everything we have. It wouldn't be big enough to power the hyperspace transmitter, but it should be big enough to smelt aluminum ore." George considered the idea. "I think we can do it." "How long until we can send the signal?" he asked. "Given the extra metal we need, the building of the generator's a simple job. The transmitter is what will take years, maybe as long as 50. 50 years. "Can't anything be done to make it sooner?" he asked. "I know," George said. "You would like for the Gurns to come while you're still here. So would every man on Ragnarok. But even on Earth, the building of a hyperspace transmitter was a long, slow job, with all the materials they needed and all the special tools and equipment. Here, we'll have to do everything by hand. And for materials, we have only broken and burned out odds and ends. It will take about 50 years. It can't be helped." 50 years. But that would bring the Gurns before big winter came again. And there was the rapidly increasing chance that a Gurn cruiser would at any day intercept the first signals. They were already more than halfway to Athena. "Melt down the generator," he said. "Start making a bigger one. Tomorrow men will go out after bauxite and cryolite, and 4 of us will go up the plateau to look for iron." Lake selected Gene Taylor, Tony Chiara, and Steve Schroeder to go with him. They were well on their way by daylight the next morning, on the shoulder of each of them a mocker which observed the activity and new scenes with bright, interested eyes. They traveled light, since they would have fresh meat all the way, and carried herbs and corn only for the mockers. Once, generations before, it had been necessary for men to eat herbs to prevent deficiency diseases, but now the deficiency diseases, like hell fever, were unknown to them. They carried no compasses, since the radiations of the two suns constantly create